Hey, good afternoon, everybody. I've got about 5 after. For the sake of time, we'll go ahead and get started. I am so excited about the turnout today and the interest in the RISE program. As I mentioned before, we've got about 40 people who've registered for the meeting, and we're representing all of the senior campuses. So we have faculty from USC Aiken, USC Beaufort, and USC Upstate out in the group. How we'll work it, you are being recorded, and for the sake of disruption or less disruption, if you can stay muted with your video off unless you're speaking to us. And so Nicole is actually monitoring the chat and the raise hand feature. So if you do have a question, feel free to bring it to the group, and we would just turn over the microphone and video to you at that point. We have Beth Heron out there with us, and she's the Associate Director for Research and Development over at USC Columbia. And so for a second, I would love her maybe to come on and so that you can kind of get a face to go along with the name. Beth, if that's okay?
Yeah, I just unmuted myself and turned my camera on. It's great to see so many people interested in RISE. Just about a month ago, Dr. Nagarkati, the Vice President for Research, developed a presentation about the accomplishments he's had in office. And one of them was RISE. And since RISE started in 2013, there has been over $1 million invested in the senior and regional campuses through the program. And what's really exciting is that from 2013 to 2019, the senior and regional campuses had an almost 50% increase in external award dollars, which seems as though RISE has had such a strong impact on the campuses. So it's always been my pleasure to be involved with this program and to administer the program on behalf of the Vice President for Research, and look forward to working with some of you in the future.
Thank you so much, Beth. And what we're going to do is go ahead and switch over to some slides to hopefully present you with a summary about the program, both intent, where we're at with it in terms of funding history, and then also turn it over for some questions. On the registration form, there was an option to submit a question, and we do have those embedded in the presentation at the end to make sure we get to them. And then also we would turn it over to any that come up as we go. And so with that being said, my intent is for, hold on one second. Okay, my intent is for the slides to be up, and so just put in the chat if you're having any trouble seeing them. And then basically we start with the question, why RISE? What is the point of the program, and hopefully kind of what can it do for you? It is an opportunity to hopefully keep faculty engaged, provide an element of professional development, and also increase familiarity with USERA. But we are part of the USC system. And so as part of that system, we do submit all grants through USERA. And so if you're starting with the RISE program, maybe it's your introduction into USERA, you just become more and more familiar with the process for submitting both internal grants, but also external grants. With the professional development piece, again, we're getting some practice with proposal development. We kind of have a wide range of experience with the process. And we're really hoping that it allows you or encourages you to stay engaged, both with your students, with your profession, etc. Many of us rely on our summers to sort of play catch up with our research. And so this is an opportunity to maybe gain some support for that time you would be spending or devoting to the work anyway. If you think of the overall history of RISE, and so the table is broken down by campus with kind of an indication of the variation in the size of the student body. the number of awards that have been submitted through time, the number of actually awards of those proposals, and what the success rate is. As Beth was mentioning, for both the senior campuses and the regional campuses, the program has provided over $1 million of support. And actually for the senior campuses alone, we crossed over that million mark last year with the funding round. When you actually look at the funding success rate, the program is very achievable. Overall, there's a 60% funding success rate, which is incredible. A lot of times with external programs now, you're looking at a funding success rate in that 8 to 20% range. And so we do definitely like to encourage you to try for the funding. If we break this down by year, okay, the first round of awards went out in 2013. And again, by campus, you can sort of track how the number of awards submitted versus the number of awards received has changed through time. There's variation among our campuses among years in the number of proposals that are received, that we actually submit each year, and obviously the number of proposals that are awarded. Overall, for any of our campuses, you can see a range in success rates where some years we have better years than others. We are competing amongst just the senior campuses, which this will come up again as kind of something exciting about the program, because we're all in a very similar work situation in terms of teaching load, etc. Now, some of the program highlights. It's interdisciplinary in scope. We'll actually look at the breakdown of disciplines so far with the program. The budget's flexible. If you actually look at those allowable expenses, there's a gamut. The program could be used for summer salary. It could be used for supplies you might need. It could be used for potential travel. Although you'll see when we talk about what might have changed is obviously with travel, COVID has impacted how you would build that into a future grant proposal. Mention it's only us. It's Aiken, Beaufort, and Upstate for this particular program. If you've received a RISE before, you can compete again. So there's not a limit on how many times you can compete within the RISE program. And so you can receive RISE awards more than once. Obviously, those would be for separate projects. If it's for the same project, so you submitted one round, you weren't funded, you have one more try to resubmit with that particular project topic. And as you look over the call for proposals, you'll notice that if submission, there are conditions. You do need to include reviewer comments, how you've addressed them, and you do get a page in addition to the narrative to let us know where you're at with those revisions. And interestingly with RISE, and something very different, is that end cap activities are actually acceptable. You can compete for, rather than simply starting a new project, right? You can kind of compete for funding to support some of those stages as we're finishing up a project. So say you have a research project completed, and what's required, what you need the time for, is actually to turn that into a manuscript for submission. That is something supported through the RISE program. You can actually compete for, again, what I'll be calling through this an end cap activity. Now, we mentioned that any discipline can compete. And I always like to show kind of a breakdown of the awards to where we're sort of saying, hey, we say it, but we mean it. And so if you actually look at the breakdown of awards, our disciplines are well represented. One thing you will notice is, say, maybe in nursing you see a 6, but then in history and political science you see a 27. You're like, look at that very big difference, so on and so forth. One thing I like to ask when we hit this point is, when you look at a distribution like that, is each year we have to remember, right? So if we were to ask the question, hey, each year what varies? Each year, the things that are going to change are not only number of submissions, but what the disciplines are represented, what disciplines are actually represented in a particular cycle. So like this year, maybe we'll only get one nursing grant and we'll get 5 creative arts, so on and so forth. All of that can change through a given round. And so when you're looking at differences in the number of proposals funded among the disciplines, that's not necessarily reflecting anything about the likelihood of funding. It can literally be just differences in the number of proposals that end up submitted to the program through time. Now, an example I like to provide, right, that shows some of those bullet points coming to life is that we mentioned you can receive the award more than once and that you could use it for end cap work. And so remember, any of these examples I'm showing, I have permission from the faculty members to use their work. What you'll notice is Bridget Doyle, in her first semester of hire, she actually competed for a RISE grant and she received one. And what she had to do was actually write up a manuscript for publication. And you'll notice kind of at the top left screen, you'll see a 2015 publication that resulted from that work. Well, she competed again the following year, received a RISE grant again, and then in the bottom right, you see a publication that came out in 2016 of the work. And so from the perspective of a brand new faculty member, how fantastic is that there was a program that, hey, you could get some support for writing, and then 2 years, 3 years into your time as a new faculty member, you've already got a couple of publications to show as you move towards promotion and tenure. And so hopefully, in that case, it's kind of like, okay, some of the pressure's off, got to do some cool things, and, I got to receive support for work I would likely have been doing anyway over the summer. Another kind of example to again emphasize end cap work was okay, but that we also support a wide range of scholarship types. And when I'm saying scholarship types, I'm talking about, okay, maybe what we would consider as traditional scholarship, but also the scholarship of teaching and learning or public scholarship. And so the variety of scholarship types that are represented, and particularly on our campuses as primarily undergraduate institutions, where we have a large outreach and community engagement focus. In this case, you see 2 of Rebecca's publications where it fell more into that category of scholarship of teaching and learning. And again, you see these were resulting publications from the support. They were more than one. And we have a form of scholarship supported, different than maybe what we would consider just traditional research. Something exciting that recently happened with Rebecca's work is an offshoot of a RISE she received last summer, was a National Endowment of the Humanities grant. And so a lot of times RISE support also leads to having preliminary data or getting pilot work completed that really feeds into success with external grant funds. As far as the review process itself, we want to go through kind of some of the mechanics, kind of an overview there. This, right, breaks every teaching rule we've been taught when you look at that amount of text on a screen. But what I did was just take a screenshot of literally the section from the call for proposals out of the research process. Because when the RISE review committee actually receives their assignment of proposals to review and receives the rubric to use, it follows exactly what you were told you would be evaluated on. There's a scholarly merit section, a nature of the proposal section. And so in that, it's, have you convinced us of the merits of your work, of the need for your work? Will it contribute to field of study? Is there an opportunity for external scholarship outcomes? And then when you hit that nature of the proposal, that starts to get to some of the nitty-gritty of what you're going to do along with the why. And so it is very explicitly outlined for you the questions that you get to make sure your proposal addresses. When you see it as an A and a B in these bullet points, it doesn't mean you need to present the information exactly in that order, right? But that would be the type of content you would want to put together in kind of a cohesive way that best represents what you're trying to do. And it can capture then variation in how in our disciplines we might represent what we would want to do with a summer research project. The review committee is made up of mainly senior campus faculty. And again, so that means we are not only just submitting proposals that are being evaluated amongst senior campus faculty, the people reviewing our work are largely senior campus faculty. And so in each of the review cycles that we've had so far, 2 of an entire review committee have been from the USC Columbia campus. All of the others are actually from Aiken, Beaufort, and Upstate. When we're reviewing proposals, right, you would not be reviewing from your own campus. And typically what you have are 2 reviewers assigned to those. And so like if you were an Upstate proposal, it would likely be an Aiken and a Beaufort reviewer, something of that nature. So we're not reviewing for our own campuses. When we're talking about that review panel, who all is sitting down to review the proposals, just like with Aspire and just like with many other grant programs, that review committee is interdisciplinary. And that's an incredibly important point to bring up, because it means when we're putting these proposals together, the proposals must be readable to those outside of your discipline. A lot of times maybe one reviewer is really close to what you do and one might be far off field. So you have that challenge of putting together a proposal that speaks across disciplines. And so kind of as a compare and contrast, if you read the 2 statements, the A and the B, the A might be something much more specific to a discipline versus the B, where many people can relate to environmental radiation or can relate to nuclear power production, can actually directly think of impacts on human and wildlife health. So just by changing a couple of words, accessibility to the content changes dramatically. And so that's something we would suggest just keeping in mind when you're putting the proposals together. Now, when you're developing the proposals, there will be several sections of the proposal that are complementary. And those would be, hey, your timeline, you have to put together a budget and a budget justification, and you have to think about those expected outcomes. And so a suggestion would be to make sure all of those things are well aligned, and so if you're talking about a timeline, and you have an expected outcome that is submission of a manuscript, did you tell us realistically when you were going to submit it and it shows up consistently in your timeline to match what you were doing at that period of time? Budget, and the budget justification, does it match kind of when you would need the funds for what you're telling us you're going to be doing in the timeline? If you need supplies, and that's a big bulk of it, in your project timeline and your budget justification, the timing of when you would use that money would be early on in the grant period, so on and so forth. Because space is limited in a grant, and we tend to have a lot of content we want to get out there, we really want to convince people, hey, this is cool work, and the support would really, really help. And so don't underestimate then the value of supplementary information. As you look at the back of the call for proposals, as you're approaching the end of it, it tells you all of these things you need to include, right? And so, if you've got that budget and budget justification, that's additional space for talking about what you need and why in the proposal. So maybe when you're mentioning budget needs in your narrative, right, you generally say, and then you can say in parentheses, see budget justification, and that's where the reviewers know to go to find more detail. Keep in mind a relatively new requirement, this came up last round, right, is we do need to know results of prior support. And so you will see that come up in the call for proposals as well. And it specifically kind of shows up in the application material section, number 4D, right? And in that case, we were talking about a complement among the supplementary information you provide and what's going on with the narrative of your work. You can re-emphasize some things strategically. And so you will have a section where you need to address prior support. You'll want to be as specific as possible, like a full publication or book citation, full conference presentation citations, an indication of if that work led to other opportunities. But look how at the bottom of the screen, the bottom bullet, the material or what you're trying to say could also be reinforced in the CV. And so if you think of one of those papers we saw of Dr. Doyle's, right, you can state the formal citation as you would in your CV, and then look at the tail end of it. All you have to do is tack on the very back of it, hey, result of prior RISE support. So then you're getting across outcome from the program, both when reviewers are looking at that section on prior support, but also as they're going through your CV. And so all of a sudden you're starting to convey more than once, right, that there's a good return on investment here, that you follow through with what you promised, that great outcomes have resulted from RISE support you would have received. Now, if you're going to request funding for a project that's similar to previous work, right, the narrative will really need to address how that work is different. Many of us have long-term projects, and so we'll be seeking funding for a particular piece of the work we're doing. And then if we request more later, there might be the question, well, wait a minute, how does this fit into what's been going on? Haven't you received funding for this earlier? Just make sure that your narrative's put together in a way it shows the building of that research program. Is what you're asking now representative of a new direction in your research program, or possibly an extension of the work you've done already? Often maybe that extension was related to what you found using previous support. And the starting point for developing the proposal is basically you have some homework, and this is true with any grant program, right? Your starting point and your homework is to literally study the program description. And I don't mean just read it casually, literally study it. Start to figure out what the rules of the game are for a particular program. And so as you're studying that program description, right, you start to develop a strategy for where you want to put the information that's required of you, that's requested of you. It helps you start to think about, okay, what's the scope of the material I need to include to make sure the proposal would have the right content of what's being requested of me, and determine your target audience. We've already mentioned in the case of RISE, right, you're going to need to write for all disciplines. And so as you think about those things, you start to have the opportunity to think strategy, strategy, strategy. What is my approach here? And so like a fun thing we would normally do, and in person, which I miss seeing all of your faces for sure, is we would kind of pause for a second and say, okay, what if we had a pop quiz? And so we said about 40 of you registered for the event, right? And so hopefully that means an interest in submitting to the RISE program, maybe for the first time, maybe again, so just kind of a refresher about what the program's about. So the hope would be that you've already read the call for proposals for this particular round. And so often what I would do is say, okay, if we were in a room together, we would kind of look around at each other and sort of ask, what's that minimum font size allowed? What are the minimum page margins? And some of you might be sitting back there going, why in the world would something like that be important? Well, for reviewers, they're trying to assess attention to detail, And then from the perspective of you as the grant writer, that's helping you figure out how much space you have to work with, right? And so if you're told Arial font, 11-point font in 1/2-inch margins, that gives you some rules of the game, right? And in that case, you should feel like when the proposals are being put together, you are space limited, not like there would be, how am I going to fill this space? And so if you know you have 1/2-inch margins, that's great, because that's much more space for content than if you were dealing with a program with 1-inch margins. So you literally, even when you're studying these program descriptions, you go down to the nitty-gritty of what are the format requirements. If you think about something really key for any particular grant is, what's that funding period? Like with RISE, we say May 16th to December 31st. When you're building your timeline, what you're needing to do with the RISE funding needs to overlay in that grant period. Now, keep in mind, this is a summer program, so you would be seeking to spend and show us that the bulk of the support was actually needed in summer months. But you do have a window if you needed to extend some of those grant activities past when we would come back under contract in August. But again, typically this program, it is a program for summer support. Show us you need that support in the summer months. And then as you look at the number 4, you can receive RISE funds and teach during the summer. That was a true false, and that's a big false, okay? In the sense that you cannot receive RISE funds at the same time you're receiving money for teaching. Now, many of us have multiple summer sessions, so it might be you're teaching in summer 1, so you would not be able to take RISE support at that time, but maybe you're not teaching in summer 2, and then it would be acceptable for that to be the portion of your timeline when you were requesting budget support from the program. The other true false, right? You can use RISE funds for student and faculty salary. That's true in this case. And where we're pulling the information is right from the call of proposals, and you go to, hey, what are the allowable expenses? And again, doing that homework lets you assess whether or not a program fits what your research need is at a particular time. Now, as far as the email that's on the bottom of your screen, as you look over that, this was basically from a PhD student that was starting some dissertation work. And so the one thing the funds one of the things the funds cannot be used for is to support degree requirements. Okay, so in this case, the answer would have needed to be no. And again, these 6 questions kind of stem right from rules you would have been, that would have been expressed to you just in that call for proposals. An ending point for your proposal development and why it's really important to start the process early is have a colleague review and provide feedback and then revise accordingly. So one of the great things, if you're working well before the deadline, is you can get that proposal drafted and have someone else look at it and actually edit it and get that back to you so that you would have time to revise. And often when you're doing this, just remember to have a very thick skin, right? And so both of the proposals that are up on the screen are faculty proposals that have sort of been edited, been bled, been shredded, whatever nice word you want to use for it. But at the same time, that was feedback you were receiving regarding the proposal, right? And so think then of, if you're submitting a revised document, how much stronger that's likely to be in the review round. When we talk about the program overall, is we're really hoping, that it persists through time. Dream world, maybe someday we grow the budget a little more, but the hopes for the program are kind of dependent on you all. That's why, Beth and I get very excited when we see interest in the program, because with that interest, right, you using the program is what would keep it going. And so when we actually, and I mentioned this before, when you registered, we had a spot where you actually would be or had the opportunities to submit questions. And so we're going to go through the ones that were submitted first and then kind of open up the floor for questions you might have. And I've left a good bit of time for questions in this case because we do have such a large group, and I want to make sure everyone would have a chance to kind of think about the information that was just presented, but then also if you have more questions, if you have concerns, if you're in a particular discipline where you might have questions about formatting the proposal, anything's fair game for a question. And so one that actually came in was related to the timing of the workshop itself. And so where there was the question, hey, is there another time we could offer this? October's super busy for online programs, open enrollment decisions, etc. Early November is better, just for future reference. What we run into is there is just not an ideal time. It is just crazy what constraints are on time all around. By having this workshop right now, we're about a month out from the deadline. That's all. The proposals are due December 1 this year, and so we're only a month out. And so to sort of make sure there was a little bit of a review of the program and opportunity for faculty to ask questions about the program, we try to actually have the workshop early enough that there would be time to respond in terms of those that are actually hoping to submit this particular grant cycle. In years past, some combination of Beth or I have traveled to the different campuses, and so there was more flexibility and maybe a variety of dates. But in this case, we're living in a COVID world, and traveling's not, an easy option right now. And so I was approached about just having the workshop we offer here at USC Upstate opened up to all campuses, which I'm excited that it did work out. But I do understand that the time element of this is so very challenging. Now, we had a question about using the RISE program to revise a book chapter so that a person could start submitting that, a book proposal with sample chapters. And so hopefully at this point, for what we went over, it's clear that writing can definitely be part of this. When I'm looking at a particular question, what I would say is, when you say revise a book chapter, was this a chapter you actually had feedback on? Because I would encourage you in that case too, if you've had feedback on it already, like a book publisher might be interested in the topic or the work you're doing, that could definitely feed into a strength of requesting that type of support. And when it comes to book chapters, right, a chapter actually can seem a bit more reasonable than a whole book for the period of a summer. And so this particular question helps address another issue that sometimes comes up in the review process, and that would be basically maybe the timeline for a summer program looking too ambitious. And so again, I want to know a little bit more about, where the book chapter stands, but yes, that would be an acceptable request. And then in terms of if there are any changes in the program between last year and this year, as I mentioned before, a fairly recent change, and so the first year was last year, right, is you will need to address prior support from RISE or Aspire VP, our research funding that you've received. In addition, as of last year, we did have to include a reminder in the formatting that, you're given text pages, right? A certain number of pages for your narrative, but they have to be 8.5 by 11. And then as of this year, under the allowable cost, whenever travel comes up, there is a COVID stipulation. Okay, and so you do have to be careful for what travel would be allowable, right? You have addressed COVID policy. And
Yeah.
going to stop here for Beth real quick. I see you're
Yeah,
on.
that's why I had jumped in on Melissa. Obviously, for last year's RISE competition, when the applications were submitted, none of us knew about COVID. And, when even during the review process, there really wasn't, it didn't exist yet in our world. This year, I think that proposals that focus on travel or include international travel, the existence of COVID will come into the review process as to whether that project would be realistic, especially since for RISE, the period of performance is this coming summer. So if you do international work, and we have funded projects that involve foreign travel in the past, you might want to consider whether this is good timing or not, because I think that is something reviewers will consider, is whether this is realistic or not to accomplish. And even if you're traveling domestically, you definitely need to address how you'll stay within USC guidelines and other guidelines and be able to complete your work with proposed travel.
Yeah.
Thanks, Melissa.
And Beth, while you're there, those
Yes.
are the 3 newest changes that came to mind. Did you have any others that were on your mind?
No, I think besides the things we've touched on, the RFP was very similar to the previous year.
Right. And one of the things to kind of touch on the call for proposals being similar was, we mentioned early on that part of the intent of the program too, in a way, is professional development. You're starting to learn kind of, the proposal calls for this program are kind of similar to Aspire, or kind of similar to, so you're gradually getting more and more familiar with systems that feed into larger budget pools for you as well. And so this is also a great stepping stone for getting familiar. But the call for proposals is typically fairly similar among years. But at this point, what I'm going to do, and like I said, Beth's here, I'm here. I wanted to leave some time. You're a large group. Ask us. What are some of your concerns? Any other questions that haven't been touched on? Were there any of the slides you needed to see again? And so at this point, I was just going to turn it back over to all of you.
Dr. Pilgrim?
Yes.
There was a question posted in the chat. It says, could you post a link where we could see samples of successful proposals?
Okay, now that'll be a question for Beth too, just in terms of anytime we do that. I know with the Magellan Scholar Program, and when Beth has led Aspire workshops in the past, and she has one coming up, sometimes there are sample proposals to view. And so this is something, do you have a perspective on that, Beth? And obviously we would need permission if we were going.
Yes, it's been a while since we've shared successful RISE proposals. Right. I could reach out to some recent applicants and see if we could get a couple that could possibly be posted, or parts of them posted on the RISE webpage.
Right. We just have to obviously respect confidentiality measures, both in terms of research content, but also identifying information, et cetera. Yes. But I'm happy to work with Beth too in identifying some of our faculty that might be willing. Like I said, anything you saw in terms of outcome in mind, Dr. Doyle and Dr. Mueller know that they're sort of in the presentation. And then other questions?
Lisa Johnson has a question.
Yes, Lisa.
Thank you. I'll try to ask my question with my video on, but if I cut out, let me know. I've had some problems with that.
So far, I can see you.
Okay, so I have a question about failure with the program. It's something that we don't talk a lot about as researchers and academics, but in thinking about making an application and addressing previous funding, I've really always been very hesitant to make another application, because I did get RISE funding in, I think it was 2015. I'd have to go back and look for sure.
Early on, yes.
And that was wonderful, and I used it, and I worked very hard. but I didn't achieve the goals that my application set for myself. It was too ambitious. And there have been times in my life when I could, sort of meet very ambitious deadlines, and then times when certain things happen that make that less possible. And so I think I have sat with a lot of shame since then for not having met those goals, and thinking, how do I then ask for support again, given that I fell short of my goals? Now, eventually, I did see some success with a part of that project, and it was good success. It was. I have something forthcoming now in a top journal that will be out in January. But it took so long, and I would not even now have the courage to bring this up if I hadn't found out that another senior faculty member who I respect a lot has had the same experience.
Right.
She got RISE funding.
Mm-hmm.
She did not meet her goal. She's still working on the project. It's 8 years later, and there's a kind of shame around.
Right.
So how do you talk about that progress without seeming to frame yourself as not a good bet, I guess?
So, I'll start, if that's okay, and then turn it back over to Beth too for what feedback she might have. First of all, we tend to be really hard on ourselves in the fields we've chosen, but there are certain approaches. It sounds like you learned a lot too about your limitations in terms of how ambitious a project may or may not be relative to other time commitments you have going on. One of the things, you do have to list results from prior support now, and that's a great opportunity to kind of highlight what went right, what went wrong. Obviously, it's very wonderful when you show delivery on a project, and that is something obviously looked on favorably, right? But at the same time, most of us realize sometimes research takes a little bit of a different turn than what we were expected. And so some of it is address what did or didn't go wrong. You'd be coming back at this now where you would show outcome. It did just take a bit longer than what you thought, but with your final report, you would have at least told us what you accomplished with those funds. Beth and I always love to get follow-up information about what happens from RISE support you've had. So even if it's a bit later, and something else came of it, send it to us, please. We love to see outcome from the program, even if it's a little bit later than what you thought. Or like in the case of just talking about Dr. Mueller's work, that helped feed into an NEH grant. She wasn't able to tell us that when her report went in right after, soon after the grant was finished, but oh my good gosh, we can get so excited now, so always follow up with us. And that becomes part of what happened in terms of outcome for that grant. Again, in the presentation, part of the suggestion was to have somebody else review your proposal. Have someone else take a look. Hopefully, if that person's reviewing it, they're also looking at what you say you're going to do, right? And that person may be able to give you some feedback and say, oh, wait a minute, Lisa, that might be just a little bit too ambitious for the time period you're taking the money. What about this as a potential outcome? And so, yes, you're going to want to show productivity with the funds, but you should not think not having the outcome you stated should completely ban you from trying again, right? And so, Beth, would you like to add?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, and I think everything Melissa said is true. You have had an outcome. You've now, even though it's been a couple years or a few years, are publishing in a top journal. I also think that the impacts can be indirect. It was a learning experience. You learned something about your field, or your premise going into your original proposal. Maybe you were surprised that it wasn't what you expected, but then that taught you something as well that maybe impacted your research. So I think there's a lot of different ways to approach that. And, I think with this kind of funding, this kind of internal funding, whether it's RISE or Aspire, part of pilot work or starting a new direction is that sometimes it isn't what you expect, or it doesn't exactly unfold like you think it's going to. And I think that's perfectly fine. So, and as it turns out, you have had a really good outcome from it. It just took a few years. That's all.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I'm making notes on everything both of you said.
All right.
welcome.
I hope to see a proposal, Lisa.
We have another question from Link Hudson.
Yes. Are you out there, Link?
That's my question. I'm sorry, my question was answered from the text.
Okay.
We have some samples. So
Okay.
I don't know if it was answered, if you've made up your mind on that, but that was my question.
All right.
Additionally, if we were writing a grant to complete a manuscript for a study we've already conducted, already collected the data, how detailed would the projected timeline need to be?
That is a wonderful question. Okay, and even beyond thinking about how detailed the timeline would be, I'd like to address kind of content in that proposal too. If you're indicating to us you are towards the end of a project and you need to write it up, remember in that narrative, you will need to convince us you're there and that what you're wanting to submit is publishable. So make sure the quality of the narrative of that proposal is very strong and would include then, if you're saying, you have the data collected or analyzed stuff like that, have you put in methods in that proposal, how you have collected the data, preliminary data, all of that would be very key. And then when you're putting together that timeline, that, you have some flexibility in what you're wanting to tell us there. If you have statistical analyses left to do and then revising text that lists, you can actually have that as an activity that maybe that's going to fill June. Whereas the revision of the writing or putting on that discussion or conclusion, maybe that's July, but maybe you need to take the money in June for salary. And so again, we mentioned having alignment among your sections, what you're saying you would want to accomplish in the narrative versus how it looks in that timeline versus how it would relate to your budget. But if you are at that end stage, you will want to make sure that's conveyed in your narrative. And often that would mean kind of preliminary data. And when I say preliminary data, sometimes minds go immediately to the sciences, and that's not what I mean either. For the different disciplines, there are ways of showing us what you have. And if you ever have a question there, just reach out to us. Beth?
I would just add, I think if you're at that stage, I also would make sure you have a specific target journal and are not vague about that. That if you're, to the point where you're writing, taking your work and preparing it for a manuscript, that one or two journals that you would plan to submit that work to. And don't leave that as a vague statement, like I'm just going to submit it for publication.
Yep, same thing with conference proceedings or conference presentations too. If we were in a world where travel was more achievable, the more detail you can give us, like dates, places, names, that type of thing.
So we have another question that asks, GPA requirements have kept some students from applying for the Magellan. Can I use a RISE award to support 12 undergraduate students with $500 stipends each to complete summer projects in my molecular lab?
I would say that would not probably be a competitive proposal. RISE is supposed to be the PI initiated proposal, something to advance your career, your work, not just to have students complete different things in your lab. It sounds pretty diffuse and not very focused. Melissa, what would your?
Yes, and in that case, I was trying to see if that was more a teaching outcome, like integration, more of research in a classroom, so not particularly important. Where we've seen students supported by the program is if they were actually research assistants with the faculty members collecting some of the data or doing these pieces that were very instrumental in what the external scholarly outcome would be from that RISE support. So we
Yeah.
have seen students supported in the program, and
Yes.
we don't put a GPA requirement on that. We rely kind of on whoever's writing that proposal to sing the praises of that student, that they've identified one. But sometimes folks are saying they would hire later. They may not have identified that student. Maybe they won't do that till they know they have the funding. So student support is okay, but it needs to feed into a scholarly outcome for the PI. And so that would be kind of my approach to thinking about student assistance.
There is another question that asks if we've received funding from other sources, i.e. not a RISE grant, and had something productive come of that and think this info would strengthen the application, would the appendix be the appropriate place to add this information?
I would say I would add that in the bio sketch. That's a required element, a 2-page. It doesn't matter what your field is. Can be in any format, but you could include prior or other current research support you have in that bio sketch. I think that's probably the most appropriate place to include it.
And it kind of goes back to the slide where you saw too, depending on type of support, where you might have an article citation from the work or a book that resulted. Right after that, you could say result from prior support and give the program name. You know, it could be result from Aspire support, result from prior Aspire support, result from some external agency.
Yeah.
You have that opportunity to put it in the face of the reviewers that, hey, look. And then sometimes if you're actually listing on your bio sketch, on your CV, your short CV, that you've received these external grants, you know, I mentioned listing them as full citations. Again, right behind that citation can be this resulted in, you know, either 3 publications or this resulted in, and you can say see publication list below. There are ways to be really strategic with getting that point across that, hey, I am a good investment.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. That was my question. I appreciate the answer on that. I did have another question.
Yes.
So I'm a new faculty member. I don't have my lab up and running yet, but what I'd be interested in applying for is support to work on some prior projects, collaborations with other, you know, outside groups. I just want to, I saw the question previously about, you know, applying to write up papers from data that you've already collected. Is that applicable even if you weren't the PI or the co-I on the project, but you assisted in that data collection?
Are you going to be the lead author on the work?
Yes.
So, you know, in that sense, you would show to us that that's what, but you'd want to make clear in each of those cases, because a lot of times this is a great program for new faculty, and some of it is to kind of try to jumpstart for you what's going on, because sometimes there's that time lag in actually getting your lab up and running. But oh my gosh, if you could, you know, be productive in that initial summer or so. And so just like when you saw with Dr. Doyle's publications, that was data she collected elsewhere with collaborators. So a lot of times new faculty are coming in with dissertations where maybe there are chapters that need to be turned into a publication. All of that is fair game. But again, it's on you to convince us the quality of that work, you know, hey, it's publishable, you know, and you've got enough of it done. You know, if you're putting that solid proposal together, we have a way of gauging how close you are to finishing that up in terms of polishing the writing, in terms of data analysis, et cetera. As Beth mentioned, you need to be very specific about where you're going to submit. You know, let us know you've thought out the target journals. And obviously, if there are going to be collaborators, let us know and maybe what the roles of each person have been.
Okay, thank you.
And maybe even a support letter. I mean, if it was a mentor, perhaps from where you received your PhD or some, you know, postdoc or something.
Yeah,
Okay.
but we have had brand spanking new folks get support through the program.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and I saw that someone asked if the proposals are submitted through USERA. They are. And just remember when you're doing the forms in USERA to select it's an internal request for the VPR's office and it's RISE Senior Campus. That's how the proposals are routed. And every year there's a couple that the wrong button is chosen, and I just want to make sure we never overlook a proposal. So that's the key to entering the information in USERA.
We also have a question that states, it is now 2020, soon it will be 2021. For data collections, how recent are the expectations for data collection for writing?
I don't know that we've ever put a timestamp on that. You've just had to convince us it would be something publishable. We're sort of looking at what that outcome could be. I can't remember a case where that's been an issue. Can you, Beth? It's just been more quality of that proposal and.
No, although I'd have to say if it was really old, like some data you'd collected 20 years ago or something, it might not be as compelling. But other than that, I think as long as the proposal would be strong and make a strong case that it would be, certainly considered.
And kind of to follow up on that, when we're saying a strong case that it would still be considered, what comes into that is convincing us based on current literature that there would still be a need.
Yes.
In your discipline for that work. Like there are ways of being strategic to convince a review committee that even though it's older data, there's still a need for it in your field of study.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely.
Also, can the conference attended be held outside the time frame of summer?
It has to be held within the time frame of the grant, which is from May 15th to 2021 through December 31st, 2021.
Right. And what I would add there is you still would need to convince us why you needed that support in the summer. Even though the conference itself could be later in that grant period. Remember, something that the review committee looks for kind of, put some emphasis on is what's going to be done in the summer, even if the conference is going to be later in that grant period. And so would you be writing a conference paper, an abstract, what would you be doing in the summer that, maybe that end result is a conference later in the grant period?
And I also, again, would caution that, I hope in fall 2021 we can go to conferences and start doing normal travel, but it's hard. It's hard to know that.
And so. I think one thing where this will be the guinea pig year, and it will be interesting to see how it works, is many of our conferences are going virtual.
Yeah.
And so there will be costs associated with those. And so something I'm fully expecting might be something we encounter this year, Beth.
Yes.
Request for virtual travel, if you will. Yeah. But just be very careful in your proposal. If it's something related to a conference or any type of travel, how you would be able to convince us that summer support is needed, right, for that being successful. And if it has anything to do with travel, how is that working with COVID? Is it something, we're virtual, but just let us know.
There was also a question that asked if the proposal is more focused on design and building of equipment needed for research, but won't actually collect typical data during the timeline, would this still fit the scope of this program?
What would be the outcome? Would it be a prototype?
Elena Brown.
Elena?
Hey, sorry, can you repeat that?
And so Nicole was reading your question about what if it was to build?
Yes.
And you would not use, are you talking about a prototype that would be completed by the end of the summer?
It would definitely be worked on during the summer. I'm not sure if it would spill over into the rest of the grant through December, but the majority of the work would be done over the summer. And then once completed would be used, in my research.
How would it be used in your research?
It would be one of the main components used for how to say this. Basically, it'd be used to prepare the samples for data collection.
For an area of research that's kind of new to your program?
Yes.
Yes. And so given your discipline, there may be a route for that, but you'd have to be very careful in your proposal to explain or attach scholarly outcome to it.
Right.
If it's a new direction for your research and it would result in you having that capability, That is something you would definitely want to come through in your proposal, and what having that capability would allow you to accomplish in your research platform moving forward. Would it be linked to, potential submission of external grants, potential submission of a new line or a new area of publication in peer-reviewed journals, that type of thing. And so you, in my opinion, you need to be very careful with how your narrative's built in that case. And Beth, do you have, I see you shaking your head, but.
Yeah, no, I was nodding. Yeah, nodding. No, I think, there, with RISE grants, there has to be a scholarly output.
Right.
It doesn't have to be within, if you're working on a journal or, collecting data that will turn into a journal article. I mean, that the journal article does not have to be submitted in the time frame, but eventually there has to be scholarly output from the work. So I think what Melissa said is exactly right. You'd have to, convince the reviewers why building this prototype or whatever it may be in your lab will, allow you to take on new directions, perhaps apply for an NSF or some other kind of external grant, or, publish results. So I think that has to be strongly argued.
Okay. Yeah, just trying to decide between this and some of the other programs, seeing what's going to fit better.
I mean, Aspire might be a better
Yes.
fit because it's a longer period of performance.
Okay.
So you might be able to say in the first 6 months of the timeline, I'm going to build the prototype. And then in the, remaining approximately year, I'm going to start collecting data, and, it's going to be a pilot study for X, or, this will result in a publication in a good journal. It's a little bit more money, so then you could include some other,
Sure.
money for a student or for yourself plus that. I think that might be,
in my opinion, you've had good success with other grant programs, Elena, and you've shown good use of those funds. And so it might be a great time for you to go ahead and do exactly what Beth was saying and target that Aspire program where you have a longer grant period.
Because typically RISE, I can't remember a RISE that's been just sort of for equipment.
Right.
I mean, there may have been one, but none that comes to my mind. Would be a rare. It would be a different kind of proposal for RISE, but not necessarily for Aspire one.
Okay. Well, thanks, y'all.
Yep.
I do not have any more questions in the chat.
Okay. Well, there were a lot of great questions.
Yes, there were. Anything else out there that's come to mind just listening to these questions? Are we actually possibly going to finish early? Now that was a surprise. That might be a sign of the times though, because we're all kind of exhausted. But please remember, even if you don't have questions now, Beth and I are here.
Yes.
We love fielding questions whenever you might have them. Okay, so don't be shy about reaching out, please. Hey, Bridget, I see you back. Oh.
Yes, got another question. I just want to clarify. I think I saw in the call that you cannot receive salary during the same time as teaching salary.
Right.
But could you put that money toward paying a research assistant or okay?
Yeah. So yes, you just can't take salary
during a teaching,
and because most people use the RISE funds for summer salary.
Right.
I would say a majority.
Right.
But if you're not going to take funds from RISE for your own salary, and instead are going to use it to pay a student or to buy supplies, that's fine. The stipulation is you cannot be paid in the same summer period for both research and teaching activities.
So you
can just make sure with that student, the work they would be doing, you're linking that to a need you have for a scholarly outcome.
Yeah.
So you could, if you were teaching in summer one, then you could direct funds toward the student in summer one, and then in summer two, direct toward salary. Okay.
Correct.
Okay. Thanks.
Lisa Johnson has another question.
Hey, Lisa.
Yes, thank you. So I know you mentioned that sometimes people mistakenly think the focus on methodology in the application seems to veer toward the hard sciences, and you reassured that's certainly not the case. We have humanities, we have fine arts applications that are successful. It's still, I think, I find it one of the hardest parts. I think some of us at least are not trained as clearly in methodology. And so a lot of it is inductive extrapolations from our, observing works that we read or scholars that we follow.
Right.
I wonder if it would be useful or possible to have a workshop that was specifically about methodologies, and maybe even about humanities and fine arts methodologies, and finding the words for those and finding the sources for those to explain and articulate what it is that you do.
And that is something that we can definitely, for those of you on the Upstate campus, this is part of a professional development workshop series we host. And so there's some potential for thinking about other topics as we move forward. But in the immediate time frame, Lisa, what I would suggest is when you're putting that proposal together, get somebody outside of your discipline to read it. Kind of have them take a look at it to where you might say, well, how are you doing this? That type of thing, just like in-house with our student research journal or with our, internal grant programs, they're across all disciplines too. So this comes up time again, have someone take a look at it. You can have someone take a look at it in your discipline. That might help you with fine tuning, editing, and content that way. But why not get it, to someone outside of your discipline and say, you see what I'm doing? Or just hand it to them blind and then have them read it and say, okay, what I do.
I've been doing that since grad school, trying to get people to put into words for me what it is that I do. But so I like that idea, and I think it's useful to draw on people out of your discipline, and even in a different college, maybe in the sciences, and you yourself provide great feedback. But I wonder if, and maybe this could just be a side sort of informal virtual thing that a few of us could create to pool our vocabulary and our knowledge base as humanities people to help each other, to help each other find the language for the work in our area.
And again, another idea might be pulling together some of the humanities folks or folks across disciplines who've been successful in the grant programs, to have them working with you in terms of language, that they've used, that type of thing.
Well,
but
I was also going to say it's just a matter of also the clarity of the proposal, explaining the significance of the output. I know that with RISE over the years, we've awarded a number of proposals in the field of music.
Right.
And I'll tell you, there are never two musicians on a RISE panel. There just aren't that many music faculty across our campuses. So someone is reading your proposal who, if you're a musician who is perhaps not a musician or doesn't even have that much knowledge of music, but we've funded quite a few proposals in that field because the proposal stood out as being clear, explaining, the significance of a composition or performance. I know Nolan Stoltz up at Upstate has been funded by both RISE and Aspire for his work. Because he was really able to frame to the reviewers how his work is significant, both to his field and sort of also, even for lay people, his work has interest and significance. So I think some of it is not just even methodologies, it's just the clarity of the proposal and explaining to reviewers how your work can really benefit your field, whatever your field is, in the humanities, whether it's art or music or something else, how your work could have significance in some way to your field.
And even though it doesn't seem like it, there is kind of a common language in academia in terms of, like, sometimes you'll see in proposals, or at least with proposal writing to some degree, in a particular discipline. So maybe in Nolan's case, hey, a composition in my case is the equivalent of a peer-reviewed manuscript in the top journal in the sciences, something where you're actually putting it out there for the broader base of, look, for my field, this is what this means. That type of thing, even being that explicit about it, because you'll often have a section where it's expected outcomes, where you can talk about the significance of that outcome.
That's great stuff. And I see in the chat, Nicole reinforced
Yeah.
First, that you yourself can be very helpful on this point. I think I'm longing for language to describe what's going on when I feel like I'm physically wrestling with the materials and I'm struggling to go from a feeling to an idea to a set of words.
Oh, yes. Oh, no. And that's the
Maybe that
challenge
part
of
doesn't
all of
need to
this.
be articulated.
Right.
Yeah.
That's kind of the challenge of all of this right now. I think kind of across the board with the time constraints we're feeling. You know, here Beth and I are saying, hey, start this early. We're doing this early so you have time to work on the proposals. But we're also realistic to know right now is really exhausting. And there are always great time constraints, but a lot of times they're even worse right now. But please don't let that discourage you from trying. So in a dream world, the part of this, the piece of it would be start as early as possible. You know, the way I phrase it to, you know, folks is when it comes to editing for someone, the sooner you can get it to that person, the better. And you'd be surprised, but Rise drafts fall in the summer now for me, that type of thing. And so, but I know that that's not always going to be the case. So don't let that stop you from at least trying. Just let that be a mark for some dream world day. But again, if you can start earlier, that helps you grapple with those ideas that are your ideas for your discipline. And then to have that time space to reach out to somebody else a little more off field.
I will definitely make the effort, and I've been thinking about it, if not putting words to paper for months, if not years. So I think I'm okay in that department. I would like to put in a formal request for extra points for doing this work with 4-year-old child chaos noise in the background.
I was enjoying the sound effects. I really miss seeing everybody in person, but I'd be lying if it's not a little bit of a smile after a virtual meeting to kind of sit back. Think about it. Think of all the things we hear that we don't.
True.
Like how many different dog barks would we hear? How many children running? Like, you know, do we hear
I do.
a car
I like
going by? You know, so there are, this is just such a strange time.
It is strange, and I always like to acknowledge any dog members of any meeting that I am conducting.
Well,
But
Elaine. Is Elaine out there? Elaine sometimes has
Elaine.
her cat plant itself
Oh, she's
right
what
in
about
front of
that?
the camera.
Here's
Oh,
one of mine.
well, she's put a big picture of him on the cover page of your.
That's extra points right there.
That'll
I'm
get the
sure.
reviewers in a good mood immediately.
So you've all seen Romeo now.
Yeah. And
I just wanted to remind everyone that the proposals have to be submitted into USERA by 5 p.m. on the deadline date. And that's just submitted. They do not have to be fully approved, but submitted by 5 p.m.
Can you explain to them what you mean by the approval process, though? Because it
Yes,
is the proposal you're done with.
Yes,
But
so you're done with the
you're
proposal. It has to be in its final form. You upload it, you hit submit. It still has to be approved on your campus by whoever your chair is, and then your campus chancellor's office.
Right.
And then
all
it comes
that
to
can
me.
happen. Yeah, all of that can happen after that 5 o'clock mark, but your finished proposal, you don't get to touch it again. Has to be submitted in that timestamp of 5.
And I will say that if you submit early and you think, oh my gosh, I forgot my bio sketch or something, I will accept additions. I'll accept and change out a revised proposal as long as you send that to me prior to the deadline. It cannot be accepted after 5 p.m. on the deadline date.
And that is really generous of Beth, so please don't take advantage of it. That's not a reason to like submit an early draft early just because.
No, and I don't mean like a draft. I mean,
and so make sure that, but she is very great about if there was some sort of glitch and a piece of the file going in and all.
Right, which
being
happens.
accessible and helping to take care of that before that deadline.
And I'm available, up until the deadline on the submission day. So if you have questions or problems with USERA, please reach out to me via email or phone.
So I did have one additional quick question.
Yes.
I went ahead and typed it in, but I was wondering if would a significant overhaul of a series of 2 classes in Blackboard be within the RISE program's purview?
No.
No. Okay.
It's because that's pretty. because that's focused on a teaching or educational outcome, and that's not within the RISE program scope. It has to have a research or scholarly aspect as well.
And so when you were looking at some of Dr. Mueller's work that was outcome from educational initiatives, remember she was getting that support for a peer-reviewed publication.
Yeah.
So there are ways of setting up projects that are designed around the scholarship of teaching and learning.
Yes. Yes.
And some of that actually matches, but just curriculum redesign, unfortunately, is not part of the scholarly.
One of the things I was thinking about, I was going to write about the old format compared with the new format and how it affected the students, because one of the reasons why my dean brought me in is because we were getting students that would pop up not only at the beginning of the class, but towards the middle, and maybe even 3/4 of the way, they would write that they were confused, that they were lost. So we've started to talk about a overhaul, and then a certain format that would stop us from receiving those email messages saying that they were confused and lost.
Well, my first thought, or just kind of a comment there, if you're getting ready to do that, really study the literature and build in an assessment piece to where maybe you're collecting some preliminary data as you go through this change that then might be competitive down the road for sort of a manuscript on assessment outcome. But again, with anything like that, you're going to have to show appropriate research design that would result in something scholarly later. And then Beth, did you have
we've had on occasion RISE proposals that are focused sort of on impacts within a campus, like within one of the senior campuses, which is a great thing. But for RISE, there does have to be a scholarly output that's beyond your campus, whether that be a publication, a conference presentation, a performance, external grant submission. So it can't just be something that, oh, this will have a nice impact here at USC Beaufort or at USC Upstate.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Keely Rhodes has a question.
Okay.
I do apologize. I hit the wrong button. I don't have a question. My apologies all.
Do we have any other questions out there?
I do not have any more in the chat.
Okay. Any others from the audience? Wow. Thank you guys so much.
Yeah, this was great.
Beth and I get really excited. We're kind of nerds about this stuff. And so when we see this type of interest, we do get excited. We are out here to help. And remember, Elaine Marshall's out there somewhere. So the USC Upstate campus and all, remember we've got Elaine Marshall out there for support too. But just please don't be shy about reaching out. We can direct you.
Yes, that's what we're here for. I mean, that's a big focus of my job over the next couple months is helping faculty both with RISE and Aspire submissions. So I'm always
and remember, we have a workshop coming up. We have a date where Beth is going to do one of these virtual workshops for Aspire.
Yes,
all of our campuses will be participating again. So just watch out for links. It'll work similar to what just happened with the RISE program, where you'll receive a link where you can register for that. And then Beth is going to get us squared away when it comes to Aspire.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you all so much for participating.
Thank you.
On this pretty day.
I know it finally got pretty.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Thank you. And if Beth, if you'll stay on for just a second.
I am going to stop recording at this time.
Thank you.